and welcome to Chess 101. I am Melanie from Charlotte County Library and History Division, and today we will be talking about terms and vocabulary. Let's get started by talking about piece evaluations. Pawns are usually worth 1 point, but can be worth up to 8 points in certain situations, which we'll talk about later. Knights are usually worth 3 points. Bishops are also usually worth 3 points. Rooks are usually worth 5 points, and queens are usually worth 9 points. Let's do a quick review of the movement of the pieces that we talked about in our first video. Pawns move forward 1 position at a time, except in the first move where they can move forward 2 spaces. Pawns take on the diagonal. Rooks can move forward or sideways in straight lines, however many spaces they want at one time. They take in their movements, so they can only take a piece if it is along their path. Knights are a little more complicated to show. If this is confusing to you, you can go back and watch our first Chess 101 video where I move the pieces and show you how they move on the board. So knights move in an L shape. They either move 1 over and 2 down, such as right here, where they move 1 over and 2 down, or they move 2 down and 1 over, or 2 over and 1 down. So the knight in the position in the red square can move to any of the green squares on their first move. Knights are the only piece that can jump, so in the starting position, the knight is the only piece from the back row that is able to move before the pawn in front of it is moved. Bishops move on the diagonal. They also take along the diagonal in which they move. Queens can move any position, any number of spaces at a time. The queen is one of the most powerful pieces on the board because it has such freedom of movement. The king can also move any direction at once, but they can only move 1 space at a time. Let's talk a little bit about chess notation. Chess notation is essentially the names of the squares, so each square is named with a letter and a number. The vertical rows are called files, and the horizontal columns are called ranks. Each type of piece is also assigned a letter for when using chess notation. The pawns are P, knight is N, bishop is B, rook is R, queen is Q, and king is K. It's important to keep the king and the knight straight because knight starts with K, as does king, but the chess notation for the knight is an N to make things a little bit easier. Each of the pieces' names are denoted by a capital letter. Let's do some practice with chess notation. Can you identify the notation for the following pieces? Go ahead and pause the video and take all the time you need. This is the answer to our practice. The black rook would be notated as RA8. The white queen would be notated as QD5. The black king is KG8. The white rooks are RA1 and RF1, and the black bishops are BF2 and BB7. Let's learn a little bit more about chess notation. Numbers followed by a period are used to mark the move numbers. For example, the first move made by white is 1.PD4. So on the first move, the pawn moved from its starting position of D2 to D4. When a piece is captured, a small X is placed between the capital piece identifying letter and the name of the square. For example, white uses their next move to capture the black pawn. The opponent moved first. So white's second move would be 2 period PXE5. So that means that on its second move, the pawn took the pawn that was on E5 and moved to that position. Pins. A pin happens whenever an attacking piece leaves a defending piece in a situation where if it were to move, it would expose another valuable piece behind the attack. Let's look at what this means. This picture is an example of a pin. The rook on d1 is pinning the bishop on d7 because if it moves, it places the king on d8 into check. Forks. A fork happens when an attacking piece attacks two or more pieces simultaneously. This is an example of a fork. Look at the knight on c7. It is forking the rook on a8 and the king on e8 because it is in the position to take either of them. Skewers. In chess, a skewer is very similar to a pin, except the high-value target is the one being attacked, and when it moves, it exposes a vulnerable target behind it. This is an example of a skewer. The queen on g7 has the king, a high-value player, on e7 in check, thus forcing the king to move, pinning the rook. The rook is pinned because in this current position, the king has to move to escape check. En passant. It is pronounced as en passant. In French, it means in passing. It is a way for pawns to capture without touching. This diagram demonstrates the en passant rule. This can be a little confusing, so bear with me. The white pawn in the starting position a2 moves to a4, passing a3. The black pawn on b4 is then able to diagonally take the white pawn as if it were still in the a3 position. So even though the pawn passed over the a3 position without stopping, it is still taken as though it were still on a3. And the piece moves to a3 instead of a4 where it was taken from. Promotion. When the pawn reaches the other side of the board, it can be promoted to any other piece. It just can't become a king or remain a pawn. It is usually best to promote a pawn to a queen, since a queen is the most powerful piece. However, it will sometimes be better to promote a pawn to a lower level piece. This is called an under-promotion. Let me leave you with a quote. Critical thinking is the most important factor with chess. As it is in life, you need to think before you make decisions. Hikaru Nakamura. Thank you all for watching, and join us next month for Chess 101 when we talk about openings, middles, and closings.